All right, so tonight we're going to talk about two chapters, and next week we're going to talk about some statistical methods you use in research. Nothing crazy, but we're going to talk about quantitative research and qualitative research methods tonight, and you know, and I'm going to try to give you some examples of each. These are not long chapters. They look complicated in the book, um, but I'm going to try to simplify them for you. All right. So first we're going to talk about quantitative. This is what most people use, although qualitative methodology is really becoming more popular all the time. So quantitative, it's called quantitative because it deals with numbers, basically. So whatever the research is, uh, people might use self-reported surveys. They might do pre and post surveys or inventories, assessments. They might use some kind of measurement like Beck's depression inventory, just still a self-report inventory, or Beck's anxiety scale and also self-report. Um, it's hard not to do a self-report, to do a totally observable assessment or a measurement. Um, so because we have to get other people's feedback about themselves. Um, so part of even though it's quantitative, there's still a subjective aspect of this. Just because there's numbers doesn't mean it's totally accurate because so much is self-reported, uh, at least in the social sciences. So, if you're getting into like experimental things, not as much self-report, but you know, uh, but when we're talking like the social sciences, counseling, psychology, social work, so much of it relies on, hey, how are you feeling? You know, that's a self-reported answer. Uh, so we kind of have to trust. We can ask it in a number of different ways at a number of different times, um, which helps. But you know, it does add to the limitations. Anything self-reported adds to the limitations of the research. So um, one of the things in this chapter, it talks about all kinds of different research designs, and you're going to be using the information in this chapter after you're done with the lit review, not during your lit review. It's after your lit review. In fact, it's the very last part of your paper because it's when you're going to propose a study to see if your model works. And you're not going to run your study, you're just going to propose it. You're going to say, wow, we think this is a great model that'll help a lot of people. Now, we'd like to propose a study to test it out, to try it out and see what the efficacy of this model is. Does it actually work? Does it help people or not? So that's kind of like the next step that you don't have to do. All you have to do is make a proposal. So there are certain things in this chapter that are kind of complicated. Uh, but I don't think they're going to show up on either the comps or the NCE. And honestly, I've done a lot of studies, and it's good to understand how they work, how like, you know, groupings work and things like that. But even statistical programs like SPSS, they don't code it like this. So it's really just what they present as far as like RXO, R random assignment, that's easy. X exposure of the group to treatment and manipulation, O observation or measurement of the dependent variable. So, you know, we are going to talk about sampling and assignment to the sample, assignment to groups. But, you know, these formulas that they present, you're not even going to use that in a statistical program. So you really just kind of need to understand what the letters represent, you know? So our random assignment of participants to groups, you know, there's a lot of different ways to assign people to a sample or a group. In fact, we're going to go over an entire list of ways to assign people, or not assign people. Uh, X, uh, okay, so usually people expose one group to your treatment model and the other group they don't expose to it. And see, they want to see if there's a difference in those two groups. And, you know, so, and then they measure the difference. Oh, so, you know, I think that I don't want to complicate what looks complicated. You know, this is pretty straightforward stuff. So I highlighted what I thought might be on these larger exams. And then I also wrote down what you might use in your paper. Um, so, you know, so I think that, uh, you know, one of the things they may ask you on these larger exams is basically the different types of research. Okay. So the first type is true experimental. And true experimental, I always picture like people in white lab coats, you know, and and masks and everything, like something in like the pharmaceutical industry or like little white rats or something like that. And you know, the purpose is comparison of treatment groups to control or traditional approaches. So true experimental, it needs a high amount of control. And that means that you don't want a lot of variables. You don't want a lot of limits to the study. You don't want like possible impacts that, you know, are from outside of the study. So it really also has to take place in a controlled environment, you know. So that's why true experimental is very rare in the social sciences because they really have to limit external variables. I remember that when I was a student, um, uh, we would really get to know certain faculty who were like permanent faculty there every day, you know. So we knew kind of what to expect from each of the faculty. But every now and then we get an adjunct faculty that we didn't know. So we would call that adjunct faculty an unknown variable, you know, because we didn't know what to predict. We didn't know how they taught, what they wanted, you know, how lenient or how strict they might be. Uh, so they were unknown or external variables. Um, the you know, So we see a lot of experimental stuff with anything that has to do with like concrete research, like, you know, pharmaceuticals, the impact of SNRIs or SSRIs or things like that. Um, so the next type, quasi-experimental, and it's a comparison between groups or the same group at different times. So this is a moderate amount of control. Um, and I just want to kind of read the characteristics. So manipulation of the independent variable, no random assignment to groups. That's a big one. Typically multiple assessments of the dependent variable. So by multiple assessments, it's not only between two groups, which it is most of the time. It could be the same group, but you measure them at the beginning, you measure them at the middle, you measure them at the end to see progress or change. Or you compare two groups, usually one that receives treatment and one that doesn't. And I would also measure those groups multiple times, at least beginning and end, to see if there's change. And so what I personally believe would be the most comprehensive and quasi-experimental would be to have two groups, to measure them both at least twice, beginning and end, and then compare if there's any change after treatment. That's a pretty typical quasi-experimental design, and it's not that hard to do. The next one, pre-experimental, comparisons between groups or within a group, but generally not over time. Minimal control, and by time, it doesn't just have to be before and after the experiment or, the treatment. It could be over an extended period of time as well. So pre-experimental, minimal control over external variables, manipulation of the independent variable or measurement of an event that has occurred for one group over which the researcher has no control, no random assignment to groups. The thing that we might use from pre-experimental is called one-shot pre-test, post-test. And that just means you're going to find a measurement like Beck's depression inventory and give it to members of both groups before and after. And the last one is descriptive, which probably does not have enough control. So descriptive is like general surveys, casual comparative or comparison, some observational, trying to describe some event or change, basically no control over the event or phenomena, no manipulation of an independent variable. So we will probably not use descriptive statistics. So we'll probably use either quasi-experimental for our research designs or pre-experimental. And later in the semester, when you develop your model and we talk about proposing a research, presenting a research proposal, we'll walk each of you through this process and come up with, okay, what type of research do you want to do? What type of measurement do you want to use? When do you want to use that measurement? So you're not going to figure this out by yourself. We're going to figure it out together. That's part of, I like it, an experiential research class, because I believe that, we can learn from listening to each other's processing of this. Oh, what they do. Wonder if I could do that. Why can't I do that? So I think it's a good way to learn about research, to actually create these studies together. Let's see. So most of this chapter talks about the various research designs. Um, so I just want to talk about some of my own research designs that I used that are quantitative. So the very first research I ever did was it's when solution focused therapy came out. And if you had me for theories class, I gave you this article in the notes. And it's so when solution focused therapy uh, became popular, and people really used it for individual therapy. But my professor, Rebecca LaFountain, she believed that um, not only would this solution focused therapy be great in groups, but she thought it would be good for kids and like kids above second grade. And also, it could be used well in the school setting because it was brief therapy. It wasn't dealing with like more severe diagnoses. Um, it could handle problems that came up in the school setting pretty well. And so the first thing we did was, we designed a treatment model using solution focused therapy in groups. And we did it over like 8 weeks, 2 months, and 6 to 8 weeks, depending. And, so we outlined the model, just like you're going to outline a model. And what would happen each week? How would I uh, how would I implement this model with this population if they came to therapy? How would that work? What would that look like each week? And you know, and then once we developed the model, we presented it to various school systems. And um, the one thing that we presented, which I really like, and I use it now, is that we'll have a group uh, where we don't use the treatment model, and we'll have a group where we do use the treatment model, and maybe they use like CBT or something like that in the other group. If we find that our model works well, then she thought it was only ethical to offer another whole treatment program after the study for the group that didn't receive the treatment. I think that's great. That's dedication. If it didn't work, if we found out that it didn't work well, then we didn't offer it to the other group. But if it worked well, we thought, yeah, it's only ethical to offer it to the other group. So that's what we did. The other thing we offered the school system is we offered to train all the school counselors in solution focused therapy, both for individuals and for groups, so that they would have the skill, after we left, well, how's it going to help them? Well, so we offered to do trainings as well. So those were the two ethical stipulations that she wanted to incorporate in the study. So we basically had permission slips from parents or guardians. We had referrals from the school. Children could volunteer as well. but they still had to get permission slips from the parents or guardians. And, you know, and then we randomly assigned the students to either the group receiving whatever the school normally used or the solution focus model. And, you know, then we used some statistical measurements and and we gave it to all the students in both groups pre-test. So we used a pre-test, post-test model, and we gave them these measurements before they had the treatment and after, so that we could measure the efficacy of the intervention. Did it work or not? Did it help these students? Um, so uh, we found that, you know, it was significantly helpful. And she eventually wrote a book about it. But this was the first article published on applying solution-focused therapy to groups in the school setting. So I think that, you know, a lot of times people think research is like pretty complicated. And, you know, 90% of all research follows kind of a similar uh, model, basically. And it's the one I just shared with you. That's that's what most social sciences use. Chances are you will too for this paper. But I think that one of the keys is I started all this way before, um, you know, modern computers. Uh, and one of the keys is basically having a good statistical program, because figuring out some of the results by hand would take longer than the study. So having, you know, a general understanding of some basic statistical programs like SPSS is probably extremely helpful. Um, another study was on, let's see, uh, well, I was a grad assistant in school, and a lot of the professors were older, and it was when the very first personal computers came out. So Apple IIe or IBM XT. And one of the very first stats programs was called IBM Statistics, ending with an X instead of CS. So they thought that was cool. And so what I used to do is type in their stats and hit return. And then I go to dinner, have a cup of coffee, maybe dessert, and look at my watch. And after a couple hours, I'd go back to my dorm and see if it was done. And I did that for, I don't know, a year. And then they came out with the second version of the IBM 286. And so, and we set it up. I built one, then we set it up in the dorm room. And first time we ran the stats program, we're like, okay, press the button. And we all literally had our coats on, and we opened the door and we heard a beep. And we're like, uh-oh, problem. But it wasn't. It was actually done computing the stats. And we couldn't believe how fast it was. Now, it would take a lot of data to wait for a computer to come to figure out the analysis. Uh, my friend works with the CDC. He's head of the medical research at OSU. And even though uh, well, sometimes he figures like predictive analysis, like with epidemics, that's some complicated stuff. But the general results from a study, not really complicated unless you've got 100,000 people in the study, like the state of Ohio, a sample from the state of Ohio. So if you've got 100,000 people and all that data, that'll take a long time to compile in a computer. Um, the Yeah, so that's pretty much quantitative. And the reason people like quantitative is multi multi-level. I would say one of the reasons people like it is because it's easy to find significance. So the magic number for participants in a study to find significance is, over 200, 250 maybe. And it's harder. So if you go below 200, if it's really a good treatment program, you can find significance, but it's harder. The more people you have, the more solid and easy it is to find significance if it actually works. Um, the fewer the number, the harder it is. So that's why, like for doctoral dissertations, if you're using quantitative statistics, they want like between 200 and 300 people in your study. And that's because of significance. We'll talk about what significance is next week when we go over basic stats. So the one reason is you want to find that your study, that your model is significant, that it works. If you find significance, that just means it's working, it's helping people. And you know, even though I think that um, it's a valid thing to study something and find out it doesn't work, well, now somebody else doesn't have to find that out. They don't have to waste their time with this. I figured out it doesn't work. I think that's worthwhile. But journals really don't. Journals want to publish models that work. So, they want the statistics to show some significance that this treatment model has some efficacy, that it's going to help people. So if you want something published, you probably have to find some significance that shows, yep, this treatment actually will help you. Another reason that's a little less ethical is that in quantitative, sometimes you can show different kinds of statistics. And if people really don't understand statistics, like I don't want to say they manipulate the statistics because they don't really change the numbers, but I don't think they share the appropriate statistics. So just to give you a basic example, I see all of these political statistics now because we're going to have an election. And I'm talking about both sides, everybody. And if you understand statistics, you'll understand the basic difference between mean, median, and mode. Averages, three different kinds of averages. And we're going to talk about them next week in basic stats as well. But for each type of average, you get a different number. And each one means slightly different things with the population. But maybe the best average to demonstrate some information would be mean, but they might try to manipulate the data by showing the mode or the median instead. And that changes the whole interpretation of the data. So by choosing which statistic you're going to share, you actually change the interpretation of the data, unless you understand, you know, which, and then you simply say, oh, they're manipulating the data. They're using the wrong average. But I see it all the time. I see it on the news. I see it, in political ads. I see it in the way organizations report data, especially like in their quarterly reports, like which will manipulate the stock market. Um, so it's important that you understand some basic stats just to see, and then that tells me more about it. I'm like, why are they manipulating the data? You know? So, I would much rather see data that's not significant but honest than data that's significant and manipulated. So that tells me more about the organization or the individual than anything else. So you have to be ethical in the statistics you share, the results you share. All right. So before we move on to qualitative, um, questions about quantitative. All right. I know this isn't the most exciting class, but All right. So qualitative. Qualitative studies are usually more interesting, but they're also more time consuming. So the first time I heard about a qualitative study was when I was a grad student. One of the professors uh, went to a town that had like some natural disaster. I forget, it was either a fire or a flood, but it destroyed much of the small town. And he found it very interesting that uh, people would refer to occurrences in their lives as happening either before the flood or after the flood. So the natural disaster became a time demarcation in their own life timeline. And that really shows the impact something has on a person's interpretation of life and the way they see the timeline of their own life. So I thought it was a really interesting study. But the way he went about it was he spent a couple years and he had all kinds of graduate assistants interviewing people in the town. And of course, he would have standardized questions. Everybody would be asked the same questions. And, but, if they mentioned something interesting, they could do follow-up questions on that topic, whatever they shared. And then they had to, just like in practicum, they had to, transpose the entire interview and type it up, just like you'll type up, a practicum tape with a client and a transcription. And, but then he really didn't know how to move all of this information and present it in a statistical way. So the interesting thing now, today, which that was 1988. So, uh, but now we do have qualitative statistical programs. So once everything's typed in, or now I guess if it's recorded, the computer will transcribe it for you, and you just have to make sure that the transcription is accurate. Once you place those transcriptions in the program, what it'll do is you can tell it to look for certain themes. Like in that case, you would type flood, you know, or you could pick other key words that, you're looking for. Like it'll also do like synonyms of words. So you might type in the word anxiety and it would pick all kinds of things like worry, anxious, all different synonyms of that word as well. And it'll look for how many times that word or a synonym of the word appear in each transcription. And it'll come up with themes. And you could also just have it look for themes without giving it any words to look for and just see what it comes up on its own. And maybe it comes up with a theme that you weren't even looking for. So one of the themes might be maybe because of the flood, young people decided to wait on having children because they were in a crisis and they didn't have a place to live. And so that changed their timeline for having a family. And that changed all of the interpersonal dynamic. So, maybe he wasn't expecting to find something like that. But back then we had to do it by hand. They didn't have computers, programs that would look at qualitative data. So qualitative data doesn't really use surveys or anything like that. It really takes the time to interview multiple individuals. I worked with some students who graduated who went on to their doctorates, and right now I have one that I'm on their committee, their dissertation committee, and they want to use qualitative stats. And I worked with their advisor and we figured out how many interviews would they need minimum, because each interview takes multiple meetings, each meeting's an hour, it adds up. So, and we figured the minimum was 12 individuals to do in-depth interviews with. And each interview takes at least an hour, and you've got to make multiple interviews, multiple visits. So if you have 3 hours for 12 people, that's 36 hours just interviewing. And so that's a lot of time for a dozen people. Um, and so now we're at the point of interviewing, and then she's going to, put everything into a computer, and we'll see if these new programs, what they're like. But they're much more advanced than they used to be. So yeah. So that's basically called the case study approach. And so, I think each individual would basically be their own little case study. You know, I think that's probably the classic way to use it. Now, there are different types of qualitative theory. There's ethnographic, there's grounded, there's phenomenological, historical. But rather than focusing on any one of those, which I think is too narrow, I include all of that data, like ethnographic and demographic information in kind of the beginning interview, so that we have stats on, all of those demographics. So, maybe what their basic income was before, after an event, things like that, what their age was, what their age is now, uh, you know, everything from all of the anything to do with gender or identity or preference or, so we try to have a very in-depth, it's almost like an assessment with a client, but, it's demographics for an interview. So all of that plays into the resulting stats and themes as well. So I would rather do it that way than to focus on something very specific. I would rather have a broad focus and just see what happens, see what the results are. Um, so yeah, all right. We're not going to do qualitative. We may do mixed. Next week we'll talk about mixed. But questions on qualitative or any questions about anything we talked about in the lecture tonight? All right. Have a good week. That's a wrap. Thanks for showing up, guys. Any questions online? You good?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay.